it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. A new island was recently discovered in the Pacific Ocean. These stories track what happened next. Chronicle 1, Indonesia. This isn't a zombie apocalypse, but I wish that it was. 9 days. Apparently 9 days, 11 hours, and 23 minutes is all that it takes to destroy a nation and major world power. I've been calculating just how long it's been since the first reports had surfaced of them first arriving on our shores and when they stormed the capital where I live, leaving a path of annihilation and untold suffering in their wake. No, these things aren't zombies. They're so much worse than that. Which nation am I referring to, you may be asking? Some call us the Emerald of the Equator, Nusantara, or the world's greatest archipelago. But I just like to tell Americans that we're the Philippines' older brother nation. At over 2/3 of the population of America, we're certainly no small country, but I imagine many of you in the United States have never heard of Indonesia before, although we've certainly heard of you. In Jakarta, where I currently make my abode, things seem darker than they've been before. While I write this, smoke wafts in through the cracks in my window and underneath my door. Sweat drips down my nose and cheeks, considering the power went out long ago, and my hands tremble as I attempt to describe what I imagine to be the worst calamity to strike humanity in thousands of years. Chittering, skittering, chattering noises echo across the city every single hour of every single day. During the daylight hours, but especially at night when I lay on the floor, wide-eyed and alone, I hear other things too. I hear the moans, the wails, the blood-curdling screams, the sounds of fires raging, cars crashing and alarms blaring. But by far the worst are the voices. Human voices that come in all manner of tongues and tones. Indonesian, Javanese, Chinese, English. What's universal about these voices is that almost all of them screech and cry and beg for mercy. But the horrible truth is, it's becoming more and more difficult to tell which ones to trust, if any at all. Some sound fresh, others sound barely human at all anymore. But during some of the worst bouts of muffled shouting, sobbing, choking and vomiting that I hear through my walls, I put as many physical barriers in front of my entryway as I can, curl up in the corner of my filthy, wet, roach-ridden apartment, cover my ears and wait for it to pass in favour of a more acceptable level of verbal chaos. Oh, how did it come to this? I was in the middle of watching a rather goofy Malaysian film called KL Zombie, one hot and stuffy December day when I decided to switch the channel, coming upon a breaking news broadcast over a new bout of rioting happening in the eastern part of the country. The indigenous people of Papua have been in conflict with the central Indonesian government since our country's independence, so this was nothing new to me, and it also wasn't news when I heard that the internet for the province was being cut off. However, the recent developments that were captured by local journalists were quite unusual to say the least. In another part of Papua, I saw as a news crew was gathered around the shore on a particularly crowdy day. A young female reporter walked along the beach while bathed in sunlight and pointed to a clump of what looked like a large, dark mass of something. It was hard to describe, seeing as it almost appeared to be fleshy and lumpy in shape, at nearly 10 meters across and 3 meters high, yet with a smooth, shiny texture. Well, that's when I realized that it wasn't a cloudy day at all, and the ocean wasn't covered in the shade of clouds above. No, the ocean was tainted black. My jaw hit the floor. The entire ocean, all the way up to the horizon as far as I could see on my cheap television, was a very dark, muddled grey, in contrast to the brightly illuminated anchor and the beach around her. An oil spill, perhaps, I mused, quickly looking up the keywords on my search engine, but I received no relevant results for this area or time. Didn't even think there was oil drilling in this part of Papua. My attention turned back to the TV, and I watched with anticipation as the anchor walked up to the black mass with a t-shirt tied around her face, I assume for the stench, and, with a gloved hand, motioned around its center while talking about the dangers of pollution. It was only then that I realized that the hulking, bloated and distorted monstrosity on the television behind the anchor was a beached whale. What kind of whale could become so deformed, and what could have done this to it? I can't imagine, but my attention, as well as the attention of the anchor, was quickly drawn back behind her as the carcass began to undulate, rumble and expand before its midsection popped like a balloon, sending a spattering of black gunk and bile, as well as a thick red liquid I can only assume to be blood, flying in all directions. Naturally, the woman, the crew, and the lens of the camera were drenched in the disgusting substance. I saw the cameraman lean down and attempt to wipe off a thin layer coating the only gateway that I had to view this bizarre occurrence. The microphone must have been coated too, because the sound was extremely muffled. But after the lens was somewhat cleansed with a cloth, I could see the anchor attempt to back away from the internal organs and viscera of the whale carcass that had just ejected themselves outwards from their natural holding place. However, as the young woman was wiping the dark goo away from her eyes and off her face and stepping away from the murky surf, I saw her stop for a second before quickly glancing back with a look of panic. But before I could inspect further, I saw nothing but static as the feed was abruptly cut off. Thankfully, with the aid of technology, I was able to take my remote and rewind from before the feed was cut and press my face as near as I dared to the TV screen, ignoring the 2-inch-long roach that was scuttling near the corner of the screen, and observed more closely as to why the woman had stopped. And I was shocked to see that it almost appeared as if the fluid and gore that had splashed onto the ground at her feet had reached out and latched onto her ankle, keeping her from moving. That's when I noticed that these weren't normal riots, and this wasn't going to be a normal December. As the death toll from the most recent bout of rioting began to rack up into the quadruple digits, I knew that the government and news agencies were lying to us about its true cause. It wasn't until I started checking the news online that I found out what was truly going on, as I saw videos of the infected. From the city of Jayapura to remote villages in the heart of Papua, it seemed reports of violence, hysteria, and disease were breaking out all over the island. And seeing footage of these people made me wonder what could compel human beings to act in such a manner. I witnessed an entire village of Papuan locals go mad, babbling incoherently and tearing at their own flesh, as well as that of those in their immediate vicinity. And every time they did, in addition to the red blood that would spill out onto the ground, that same black fluid would splash on their clothes, hands, and feet. This wasn't just a native problem either. As I saw footage someone had captured from their cell phone of a hospital in Jayapura where the walls looked almost completely black and slick, coated by the oily substance, with lunatics running around in the fray, who, as seen by their black eyes, veins, and mouths, were all affected with the same contagion and all screaming. But I could actually understand what they were saying now, and found to my shock and horror that they were not the ramblings of lunatics losing their minds, but rather cries of pain, pitiful sorrows, and sometimes aggressive threats as they jumped on and ravished any and all hospital staff they could see who weren't already infected. Right before the filming spectator was rushed by an infected doctor, the aggressive creature in the white lab coat said something quite strange. The madman clicked and bellowed as he whacked the phone out of the cameraman's hand and onto the ground, cutting the live stream. Other cases were filmed from helicopters, and although not quite as personal or frightening as the handheld footage, it was far more disturbing as you could plainly see the true scope of the disaster, as it was clear by this point they'd taken the streets. Thousands of them screeched nonsense and violently destroyed everything in their wake, grabbing men, women, and children out of cars and ripping out their throats or puncturing them with their claw-like hands, only to have those that they just dispatched rise up and join them, sometimes within less than a minute. Some of the infected were almost unrecognizable as human beings, nearly coated head to toe in that oily black slime, with legs and arms stretched far too long for their bodies and twisted into ungodly positions. I watched all this carnage break out from the comfort and safety of my own home, on my laptop screen, for a while at least. Indonesia is an archipelago, you see, a chain of islands strung across thousands of kilometers, and hence I thought I had enough time to get things in order before this contagion, or whatever it was, could reach my neighborhood in Jakarta on the island of Java. However, by this time I could receive no further updates, as it appeared that the president had signed an executive order completely shutting off commercial internet access in the entire country, supposedly in order to curb misinformation. Even those trusty VPNs couldn't seem to crack the encryption that's keeping the world from knowing about the peril we 260 million souls now find ourselves in. Although, truth be told, I have no way of knowing if the rest of humanity is faring any better than we are. This was the turning point that set the entire city into panic mode, as civilians razed stores, looted small shops, and stole any and all supplies they could in order to barricade their homes and prepare for the worst. All while local police and soldiers either stood by and watched, or often joined in, abandoning their posts in order to be with their families and loved ones. Well, like the procrastinator I am, I stayed at home until it was too late. By the time I finally exited my 16th floor apartment, I was greeted with utter bedlam on the streets below me, and even in my own apartment building, as families dashed back and forth, some of whom were clearly infected, as seen by black veins running up their necks, but had not yet fully lost their minds. I was able to grab a handful of supplies from a local market, a few dozen bananas and plastic bags full of canned goods, but it was extremely treacherous and risky a journey, as I witnessed dozens of infected shambling in the streets. Several actually attempted to approach me, while others still shouted out to me before growing increasingly frustrated and angry when I ignored them. But thankfully they directed their aggression at other uninfected passers-by. Well, it's a goddamn miracle I made it back alive and uninfected. After this, I strictly relegated myself to the inside of my apartment, pushing my mattress, drawers, TV stand, TV, and anything else against the only door into my home. But after several days of isolation, curiosity got the better of me. I'd taken up people-watching from the safety of my apartment, looking down at the chaos and destruction taking place below. The sole window located in my apartment faces out from the front of the building, and one evening I looked down in bewilderment and terror as I saw my neighbor from across the hall, a Dutch expatriate named Jens, stumbling down the street, clearly infected, as seen by the light trail of black ink droplets left behind in his wake. He careened and shuffled from side to side, desperately asking fellow infected pedestrians if they could help him, but to no avail. One large infected man he drunkenly bumped into reacted aggressively, shoving him across the street and onto the ground, sending his head smacking against a nearby mail drop-box. The drop-box was solid steel to keep thieves at bay, and hence, when he hit it, I could see from my window that a large tear had opened up on the side of his skull, sending a fresh wave of blood and tar dribbling down the side of his face. That's when his head slowly drifted up and his eyes met with mine. I immediately ducked my head back into the seclusion of my 2-room home. "Wait, I found it," Jens stuttered out ecstatically, as I imagined he began pointing out directly towards my apartment, since I was one of the few neighbors he would recognize. I cursed myself for my recklessness, and waited with bated breath for the inevitable. It was only a few minutes before I heard the awkward gait of the creature that used to be Jens, making his way to and fro down the hall, and I nearly yelped in shock and fear as soon as I heard the same stuttering, clicking noise I'd heard him make earlier on the street. It was approaching, and fast. I braced myself against my makeshift blockade as quickly as I could, before I felt and heard a series of belligerent knocks in rapid succession on the other side of the flimsy, thin wooden door. Knowing that the thing that once was Jens was only inches away on the other side was profoundly panic-inducing, but I knew I had to stay absolutely quiet. "Neighbor," he called out in an almost jovial tone. "Neighbor, I think something's wrong. I need to go home." My eyes began to well up with tears of fear and pity, and I gritted my teeth as I saw the doorknob begin to turn and felt a much greater pressure coming from the other side of the door. "You fucking idiot," I thought to myself. In my haste to block off the entrance, I'd completely forgotten to even lock the front door in the first place. "Everything hurt," he let out in a sorrowful plea, but I refused to budge even an inch or exhale the breath I've been holding for a good half-minute now. By another extraordinary miracle, I heard the door on the opposite side of the hall open up, and the mounting pressure against my door immediately ceased, as my aggressor was now drawn elsewhere. My eyes drifted downwards, and I saw a pool of black goo and red blood had seeped through the crack of my door, which I made a quick mental note of to keep away from at all costs. "Please help me home," Jens screamed at my unknown saviour. "Please get me home." Whether the person who served as a distraction for my dangerously insane neighbour was infected or not was not my concern. I couldn't have helped them even if I wanted to. Thankfully, that was the closest call I've had since I barricaded myself here in my home, but I haven't got any more hopeful. It's been weeks or even months now since I lost power. I've all but since stopped thinking about track of the days. I doubt it's even the same year I think it is. But they're not zombies. Zombies don't make conversation with themselves late at night in the middle of the street, or yell obscene rants at the top of their lungs in the apartment above, or beg for assistance while alone in an alley, only to turn and attack you once you come near, switching from begging for assistance to begging for forgiveness. All this I've witnessed and more, leading me to the conclusion that the minds of these infected people are at least still partially intact, and they still maintain some degree of autonomy over their movements. Although the contagion seems to have a greater control over their physical bodies, their brains, however poisoned, are still very much alive and fighting, and losing for control. I don't know what this thing is, or where it came from, but it's changing people. They act erratically, and sometimes seemingly without purpose, but the one thing they have in common is the desire to spread the contagion, which is why I imagine there's so much vomiting, bleeding, weeping, and even spitting going on with the infected, spreading that disgusting, foul-smelling black sludge onto all surfaces within sight. I cautiously took a glance out of my window earlier. For the first time in weeks, I'm starting to see new things, fascinating, wonderful, and terrible things. To inspire wonder is not always for the best, however, as the only emotions the revelations of the outside world could muster in me were complete and utter horror and anxiety of the highest magnitude. The sun no longer shines through the never-ending stream of dark clouds that have enveloped the city. The clouds, a thick and unnaturally dark shade of black, release black rain onto the streets below from time to time, and I can only imagine what would occur if myself or any other healthy human were to be exposed to even the smallest drop. It seems that the contagion which is causing all of this is beginning to mutate, or perhaps this was the evolutionary end of its life cycle the whole time. Fleshy black tissue is now bursting out of the windows and doors of buildings and homes of all shapes and sizes. I made the mistake the other day of looking at the skyscraper next to my own building. I saw a patchwork network of slimy, revolting organic appendages branching all across the structure, almost like overgrown vines or plant life. In the center of this new unnatural mass is the most puzzling, though not the most disturbing alteration. A large, blue-tinted collection of translucent flesh is now visible, gently pulsating and contracting back and forth. Some nights it even emits a bright neon blue light, bathing my small apartment in its horrific splendor, forcing me to bury my head in my knees in order to avoid this constant reminder of my torment. Some buildings are even connected by strands of stringy black flesh that almost look like ropes of black snot strung together after a sneeze. Without question, though, the worst part is the collection of arms, legs, hands, and faces that lay embedded in this black flesh, their skin fused into the new walls of what were once great skyscrapers. All of them are still alive, gasping for air to fill lungs that likely no longer exist. Yet many are still capable of talking, shouting and bawling, with black tears flowing down their twisted faces. All this happens in complete darkness, or worse, illuminated by the pale blue light of the new sun that formed in front of my building, giving me a shockingly clear view of the pain, desperation, and regret etched across the thousands of faces of infected that litter the walls. Java is a crowded island, you see. Over 150 million people, a size nearly half that of the US, all crammed onto an island the size of Florida. Imagine a seemingly endless, sprawling city with countless people to use and consume as biomass for whatever sick and demented endgame this contagion is working towards, not caring about the mental and physical collateral it inflicts on its victims. The collective human suffering on this island must by far eclipse that in all of Asia during World War II. And by the time this is over, I have a feeling that the entire city of Jakarta will be alive with the flesh of human beings and other animals, infected and converted into these dreadful, strange new life forms that litter the area. All the while, the last remaining unassimilated infected roam the streets against their will, and the assimilated infected scream in agony and confusion while conjoined with the greater hive. It's now been 4 days since I ran out of food, and although when I dared to take a peep at the streets, it seems like they'd mostly calmed down and cleared of infected individuals since when I'd last looked a few weeks ago, those large, swaying black tendrils that are growing out of the buildings and storm drains are possibly even more horrific. I think I can say with confidence that this island is the closest place to hell I can think of on the planet. Chronicle 2, Japan. I woke up gasping for air days after I'd hanged myself. Contrary to popular belief, Japan doesn't actually have the highest suicide rate of any country in the world. That distinction actually bounces between various Eastern European countries each year, and even though we are up there, the global perception of a universal suicide culture in my country is greatly exaggerated. Well, I've never been suicidal or considered self-harm earlier in my life, but about a month or so ago, I hung a noose from the rafters and wrapped it around my neck, hoping to end my life. I only made things infinitely worse. I live, or rather lived, in a small oceanside town in Hokkaido, Japan, with my parents. Yes, I'm nearing 30, and although my lifestyle is becoming quite common for a growing number of unmarried men here, they have many names for us in Japan. Parasite single, herbivore-man, social recluse. As can be expected, none of these are quite pleasant and all designed to bring humiliation and shame, which is part of the reason I never leave the house and meet people anymore to begin with. I have few wants or desires that can't be fulfilled from here in my parents' attic anyways, as I have all needs, physical, emotional, sexual, met with relative ease. Trekking downstairs every now and then for food when I hunger, playing through computer games when I'm bored, and turning to the internet for gratification when I'm desirous. Rinse and repeat every single day. The only main issue I have is with hygiene, as one can imagine. I shower only once a month, sometimes less, and the pile of rotting food and garbage in the corner that I can't be bothered to clean is beginning to let out a foul odor and attract scuttling insects of all kinds. This may be a shell of a life for some, but It's all I've known for the past decade, which is why I was nearly shocked beyond words when my mother stumbled in the house one cloudy day in an absolutely atrocious condition. I was stocking up supplies for the week downstairs when I heard a banging at the kitchen entryways, and although I usually never answer the door under any circumstances, I was quite puzzled when I heard my mother's voice calling out from the other side. Did she lock herself outside? I mused. Naturally, I went to open the door, but jumped back and dropped the bag of chips I was holding in disbelief once the dishevelled woman stepped inside. Her stringy black hair was caked onto the side of her face with dry blood that seemed to originate from a gash on her forehead, and I saw other spots of dry blood near the edges of her mouth and hands as well. However, in contrast to the old blood on her face and arms, a fresh liquid also appeared on her as well, a much thicker, darker liquid that almost seemed to be streaming out of her tear ducts, her nose, mouth, and possibly ears. I couldn't be sure. The dark fluid was also smeared across her clothes and body, the latter of which was unnaturally a pale colour. "Mother, what happened to you?" I gasped as she stumbled inside in a stupor. "Father, come quick." Mother merely swayed back and forth and looked at me in confusion, her head cocked to one side with her mouth fixed open just a bit, sending a string of black saliva drooping down onto the floor. "What are you doing home, son?" she questioned in a slurring, stuttering voice, reaching out to grab my arm. Well, I stepped back without hesitation. Call me brash or uncaring, but I didn't want her to touch me in this horrid state. My father stepped into the room at this time, taking in a deep, sudden inhalation and rushing forward to meet her, placing his hands on either side of her body. "Why is our son home?" Mother repeated, gesturing to me. "He has school today. He can't be late again." Father and I exchanged bewildered glances before Father turned back towards her and attempted to get her to sit at the kitchen table. "Rico, you are not well," Father shouted while placing her onto the wooden chair. "Stay here and we will get you help as soon as possible." Father pointed to the home phone hanging on the wall and motioned for me to take it, but I was ahead of him, already moving towards it. Once I pulled the phone out, I dialed emergency services, but received nothing but a dial tone as a reply. I told my father as much, and he seemed quite angry with me, quickly running over to see for himself, before pulling out his cellular phone and trying again, but to no avail. Father then ran back to Mother and picked her up in his arms, struggling to open the front door as I stared on, dumbstruck. "What are you doing, you idiot? Get the keys!" he barked as he slipped outside and started running towards the car, with my mother coughing and sputtering and spitting in his arms. Well, I rushed to the counter and snatched the family car keys from the rack, hastily following my parents out the front door and to the car. Mother screeched and howled the entire way to the hospital, and as we slowed upon our arrival, I was disheartened to see the large crowd that had gathered around the hospital, blocking our car from pulling up to the front entrance for dozens of meters. "Wait here," my father told me, opening the back seat of the car with Mother in his arms. Well, as soon as he stepped out of the car, I saw Mother's dirty hands reach up for her side and latch onto his throat, tearing out a large chunk of meat, before she leaned forward and spat black slime into the newly created wound, causing my father to recoil before falling to the ground while screaming and wildly flaming his arms. I bellowed out to them, but in my panic I stepped on the accelerator, slamming into countless people in the crowd before realizing my mistake and switching to reverse. The members of the crowd that had gathered outside the hospital were anything but peaceful, chasing down news reporters and pedestrians before pinning them to the ground and spewing chunky black sludge directly into their faces, screaming out apologies and expletives to their victims the entire time. One young man with blackened eyes was violently hurled face first against the windshield of my car, sending a spattering of black spit jettisoned against the glass in front of me. "Asshole!" the young man shouted at me, shaking his fist at me. "Get out of the car and face me like a man." Well, the man and many other strange people had begun pursuing my car once I took off. Their eyes clouded over with a black glaze and dark liquid splattered across their faces and bodies. But once I made it to the highway, I was able to easily outpace them and start to make my way back home. Their screams and wails and clicks echoed in my mind the entire drive, but I soon realized that they weren't only repeating in my head, as I heard them all around town, not even ceasing when I finally made it back to my neighborhood. I was Son's parents this time, and the sky seemed much darker than it had before. In my fear and timidity, I bolted into my house as soon as the car entered our driveway, and scrambled as fast as I could to open the entrance to the attic and pull up the swinging door on the ceiling. In a bout of short-sighted pusillanimity, I'd forgotten to bring food, water, or any form of weapon, not that we had a lot of those around here, and most importantly, I'd forgotten to lock the front door, which became apparent in a couple of hours once I heard the front door slam open and footsteps storming through the house. I remained huddled in the corner of the attic as I heard both mother and father call out for me from underneath in the house. I could hear the groaning and clicking noises between the howls of anger and insults they would throw out directed towards me, such as "worthless child," "little worm," or "shameless loser." Clearly, my parents were never particularly proud of me or my accomplishments in life, but I'd never seen them so aggressive before, as I heard them viciously tear apart the house looking for me. But it appears in their altered states, it completely slipped their minds to try and pry open the attic door on the ceiling. It took almost half a day for the creatures who'd been my parents once to finally leave the home, and it was another 3 weeks of isolation in the attic before the hunger was far too unbearable. I'd taken a peek outside of the attic window only a handful of times since then, and I was met with horrific sights. A completely darkened landscape that I almost thought was the night sky, had I not seen tiny rays of sunlight peeking through the unnatural canopy. Human beings that should have been long dead, with throats slashed or faces mutilated, running around and babbling at the top of their lungs. And worst of all, thin black tendrils that snaked up and around the surfaces of most of the buildings in my neighborhood, sometimes encasing the black-eyed, infected individuals against the walls while they thrashed about and begged for help. I saw jet-black roaches scrambling around in the corner and on the ceiling of the attic, leaving trails of inky goo in their wake, and I knew then that I had no choice. No rescue was coming, and my once safe refuge was rapidly becoming contaminated. Now, before you get some inane, romanticized Western idea that all Japanese are in possession of a katana or similar samurai sword in their homes at all times, weapons of any kind are actually exceptionally rare in most of Japan. Most who actually hold on to these historic artifacts of war would never dream of actually using them in self-defense or self-harm. As unpleasant as it sounded, I knew that hanging was the only logical option in order to end this nightmare I found myself in. Now, you have to understand that I detest pain of all kind and am a complete wimp when it comes to any kind of uncomfortable experience. So you can imagine my hesitation in following through with this terrible act. But weighing my options, I saw it as the most efficient and logical way to put an end to my suffering. I've heard horrific stories of people hanging themselves only to regret their decision and die in an unimaginable amount of agony as they attempted to free themselves from the noose, but to no avail. So I made sure that it would be the fall and snap of my neck that killed me, rather than asphyxiation. This was no easy task, as I actually had to stack up all the furniture in the room in order to reach the rafters and securely attach the rope before tying it around my neck and preparing for the plunge. I cautiously and shakily climbed up the haggard stack of furniture several meters high I'd made underneath my homemade bedsheet noose, before affixing the tight cloth rope around my neck. I cursed God and my entire civilization before shutting my eyes as tight as I could and jumping from the wooden beam. In the end, at least I would die human, were the last thoughts that went through my head as I fell to the ground and caught fast on the rope around my neck. my world immediately fell into darkness. Have you ever heard of anesthesia awareness? Well, when I was at the dentist as a teenager getting my wisdom teeth removed, the practitioner had not properly administered enough anesthesia to fully numb the procedure or render me unconscious. I was still completely immobile and felt the agonizing pain of drills and other instruments burying into my gums and jaw in order to remove the teeth on all 4 corners of my mouth. It was an excruciating ordeal that I thought surely had lasted for hours. But afterwards my parents informed me that I was only knocked out for 20 minutes at the most. Well, my death and resurrection was similar to this experience. The first thing that I felt was a red-hot pain in my neck and spine that, quite frankly, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life. But for what seemed like days, I was unable to move a single muscle, not even to open my eyes. The pain was similar to a pinched nerve, only far more widespread and intense, and, unlike a pinched nerve, there was absolutely no period of respite, as waves of shocking needle-like sensations shot through me. After what seemed like a lifetime, I was finally able to gently flutter one eye open, followed minutes later by the other, and when my surroundings finally came into focus, I saw that I was back in hell once more. I was unable to move anything at this point other than my eyes, and as they darted back and forth across the room, I felt confusion and dread overtake me. How was I still alive? Did my suicide attempt not work? I thought for sure it was foolproof. I silently hung from the same position that I'd taken my own life in days earlier. Everything was still a bit blurry and sound was greatly muffled, almost like I was underwater. And that's when I felt a tickling feeling in the back of my throat, almost like a feather gently brushing against my ear. With all my remaining authority, I commanded the muscles in my throat to obey me, and with much effort I finally managed to cough, which was quite difficult with the strain of the rope still pressing against my neck. But this was soon followed by another raspy, choking cough, the last of which sent a small, black speck flying out of my mouth and onto the floor. My eyes focused on the strange sight, before it swiftly shot across the room, and with disgust I realized what had just exited my body. A small black roach about 1 centimeter in length. I couldn't feel much in my extremities and certainly couldn't move anything down there, but I immediately started to gasp for air through the constriction of the rope, coughing and spluttering and spitting as much as I could, but all that I ejected from my body this time was small amounts of black spittle. How did this happen? My mind thought, before I put the pieces together. After I'd hanged myself, the small black roach must have crawled across the support beam, down the rope and into my mouth, infecting me with the same parasite that was causing the mutations around town. Unfortunately, because I had a broken neck in the fall, I was completely powerless to escape or do anything to alleviate my current predicament, which, little did I know, was about to get so much worse. I hung up there in the attic like a pathetic worm on a hook for what must have been weeks, silently taking in the familiar sights of my room and memorizing its layout many times over. Sometimes I had dreams or hallucinations that the rope snapped, and I was freed from this prison, magically regaining feeling in my arms and legs before purging the black fluid from my body and running away to safety. But when I reopened my eyes, there I was, still swaying back and forth from that damned rope. I gave up screaming long ago. With my crushed windpipe, all that was able to escape from my mouth was a pitiable wheeze and breathless, incoherent stuttering. I had no idea how this parasite worked, or how my body had rebooted itself and reobtained consciousness in the first place. After one particularly fruitless day of attempting to crane my head to the side and thrash my chin about wildly, I could finally start to regain some sensation in the upper portion of my body, especially the chest area. I felt something else tickling the back of my throat and gagged, but this time whatever was obstructing my airways was much larger than before. I coughed and coughed with every last bit of strength I had left in me before feeling something slimy, prickly and hairy on the back of my tongue, and something else brushing against the roof of my mouth. Without pause, I spat and finally managed to expel the object from my mouth, which fell to the ground with a thud. My eyes slowly glanced down at the sight which has haunted me ever since. A black roach the size of my thumb with visibly large antennae and 6 scuttling legs clambered back up the wall with unmatched speed. Slowly, I came to the horrific realization that the feeling I was gradually beginning to experience in my chest wasn't me regaining sensation, but the tickling of dozens, possibly hundreds of roaches or other insects that had made their way into my chest cavity, squirming and crawling around inside of me while I was helpless to intervene. That's when utter panic set in and I started letting out pitiful moans and rocking my head back and forth in a seemingly futile attempt to break free from the rope. But after hours of this subtle repetitive action, I could finally see that my body was indeed swaying ever so slightly and that my right arm was moving just a hair. It took another day of this unbearable pain in my neck and squirming in my chest and throat before I discovered that I was able to barely wiggle my right hand side to side, and after another 2 days, I was able to lift my forearm completely into view in front of my body, and saw small bumps moving just underneath the skin, even though I had no sensation in the limb whatsoever. It felt a lot like falling asleep or laying on a limb for too long and cutting off blood flow to the nerves, leaving you without feeling but still some degree of motor control over the stubborn appendage. I actually started feeling subtle pins and needles in my legs before my arms, which is when I discovered that I actually had far more control over my lower half than my upper half, and this realization led me to kicking my legs as much as I could, but in this state it looked like it was merely gently lifting my feet up and down. Directly after this, I felt a tickling along my thighs, underneath my pants, and scampering all the way across the length of my legs. I could barely make out the dull thud of a small insect body hitting the floor. I didn't even want to think where it had come from. And finally, after weeks of torment, I was able to regain some feeling in my right hand and could completely lift it up over my head and grasp onto the noose. But it was far too tight for me to undo while my full body weight was pulling it taut. I was completely hopeless. I thought that I truly never was going to leave this place. My vision slowly started to dim, and I thought surely to add insult to injury, I was going to go blind now as well. But after I blinked, a wave of black tears rolled down my cheeks and onto the floor. This was soon followed by another bout of coughing, sending 2 large roaches flying across the room and scurrying into the dark corners. I wasn't going to let these horrid, disgusting insects win and make a nest out of my own body. The next day I put my right arm back over my head and, with a firm grasp on the rope, swung my limp left arm back and forth before swinging it up with all my might, catching the rope in my hand just underneath the right. I pulled and strained like I'd never had before in my life, and for the first time in weeks, felt a slight relief from the constriction around my throat and the pain in my neck. I took in a huge lungful of air. My arms were still too weak, however, and I plummeted back into my standard position, the rope catching on my throat once again, sending another, much worse, electrifying spasm of pain across my neck. The pain was so great this time that I simply closed my eyes in defeat and attempted to drift off to sleep in order to avoid it, having a dream of another miraculous escape and cure for the contagious dark liquid and roaches inside of me. God, it felt so real, I would have believed it actually happened, had I not still been swinging by a rope wrapped around my neck when I opened my eyes. When I woke from my pleasant fantasy and was met with the familiar landscape of the attic, I was furious. I wanted to inflict pain on anyone and everyone in my vicinity, so they could feel only a portion of the torture I was feeling. I wanted to tear off my own skin and rip the roaches out of my organs. Realistically, though, I knew there was only one way out of this situation. I patiently waited 2 whole days in the darkness of that room, silently testing the abilities of my limbs that were slowly returning to me, gradually regaining feeling in my lower body and looking in horror as the black insects started to burrow out from beneath the skin of my arms and chest, causing a tremendous amount of pain and leading to dark liquid spilling out and coating my hands. I felt something tickling the inside of my ear canal, and I gingerly lifted my hand and poked a finger inside, hearing a dull squish and feeling something wet slide down the side of my face. Well, it turned out the sounds in this room weren't muffled, and there was nothing wrong with my hearing at all. My ear canals were merely blocked by insects who'd laid their eggs there and obstructed the sound. Right, now's the time, I thought. I placed both hands up above my head, grabbed onto the rope and lifted like my life depended on it. I felt the pressure release from my throat once more, and, centimetre by centimetre, I slowly conquered the rope, putting one hand in front of the other in my slow ascent. The pain in my arms and chest while climbing was indescribable, but I knew that the punishment for failing was far worse, and hence I pushed on. Right before I reached the top, my left hand slid down a bit, my wet, slippery hands grappling with the sheet rope, but I soon caught on once more, pumping my legs as much as I could and gyrating my body in such a way as to give me enough leverage to clamber on top of the support beam. I gasped for air on top of the beam before letting out a hoarse, croaking howl of victory that probably came out no louder than a whisper through my damaged airways. I wasn't quite sure if those would ever come back the way the feeling in my body did. I slammed my fist onto the wooden rafter in triumph, which immediately creaked and then gave way, sending me tumbling 3 or 4 meters to the ground, landing on my noodle-like legs in an extremely awkward manner. I heard a sickening snap and looked down to see white bone jutting out from the black muscular tissue of my leg, which was accompanied by more searing pain. I'd never broken a bone before, and even in my living dead state, it was more agony than I thought I could handle. I figured I'd surely pass out, but before I could, I saw a wave of black roach nymphs scattering out of the exposed flesh of my broken leg. They poured out like water in all directions, almost looking like large angry ants crawling out of an anthill, the entire time biting my skin before taking off into the darkness. I felt something surging in my throat once more, and vomited a continuous stream of black fluid to the side, seeing living and dead roaches of all sizes swimming around in the viscous liquid as well. I pulled myself into the corner of my old bedroom and struggled to find my notebook and pen from my drawer. Well, I don't know how legible this note's going to be, but I am transcribing my journey down while I can still do it, in order to warn others not to attempt what I did, just so as to spare someone from this same nightmarish ordeal. I was a coward, and this is my recompense. There is no respite for my condition. There never was. One way or another, I was destined to rot in my own body. But maybe I can find a way to finally end this suffering. I think I'm going to crawl or hobble to the outside world now. Literally anything is better than this tortuous existence in my room-turned-prison. I don't know where this contagion came from, how it started, or why I seem to have more control over my mind than others. But if anyone comes across this note, please do not make the same mistakes that I did. So the new island in the Pacific was one of the most popular stories I've done in recent months. More than 200,000 people have watched that video already, so it made sense to me to do some of the follow-up stories. Hope you enjoyed those too. There are more to come, so if you did enjoy them, please let me know, and I will continue to read the other Chronicles, I guess. Yeah, okay. I might even do them tomorrow night if I feel like it. So let me know in the comment section below the video. Thoughts, feelings, and desires. Whatever you feel like writing in the comment section. And I'll do my best as ever to reply to as many as I can. Well, that is enough for me for one evening. It's Friday. You have a good one. Enjoy the weekend as best you can, and I'll be back again with you very, very soon. Till the next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.